We are officially 4 weeks into the NFL season, so in today's video, I want to give a panic meter rating to all 32 teams in the NFL. So as I mentioned, we are going to be doing a panic meter rating for each individual team, and to do so, I decided to divide every single NFL team into one of 3 categories. Our 3 categories that we'll be doing for this video are going to be totally fine. These are teams that don't have any issues going on for them. Then there's the moderately concerned category, which these are teams that should be a tad bit worried, but not quite yet full-on panic. And then our last category is going to be full-on panic. And because I don't want to make this video a 30-minute long video where I talk about each individual team, I will definitely have to skip over a couple teams, but we'll definitely talk about some notable ones that are in these lists. However, when we get to the official panic, these teams should be panicking category, I'll go into detail about every single team. So if I don't go into full detail about your favorite team, let me know in the comment section below and I'll make sure to respond. But with that being said, we're going to begin with our totally fine category. So as I said, we're going to begin with our totally fine category, and the teams that are in this category are going to be the Buffalo Bills, the New England Patriots, the New York Jets, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Baltimore Ravens, the Houston Texans, the Kansas City Chiefs, the LA Chargers, the Denver Broncos, the Washington Commanders, the Minnesota Vikings, the Detroit Lions, Green Bay Packers, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and lastly, the Seattle Seahawks. For a lot of these teams, these are pretty self-explanatory. These are teams that are either on schedule, for example, like the Denver Broncos. In my opinion, they're a team that is fairly on schedule. I know they haven't had a pretty season so far, but you're 2-2. Bo Nix has looked good in spots, and I don't think there's anything that's necessarily having me big-time panic about that team. And then if you look at a team like the Jets, who I also have in this category, I kind of expected a slower start with Aaron Rodgers having that torn Achilles from last year. I expected there to be a bit of some growing pains for this team. So for them to be 2-2, it doesn't really shock me. If anything, it's probably a little bit more impressive that a 40-year-old coming off a torn Achilles is performing that well. Some other notable names that maybe you guys have some question about would be a team like the New England Patriots. Listen, this is a really bad team, and for them to even have one win, in my opinion, is a big-time win for them. They're not a good team. They have Jacoby Brissett as a quarterback, plenty of offensive issues, plenty of defensive issues. So for them to be 1-3, I think is totally fine because this is a team that's rebuilding towards the future. Of course, the Baltimore Ravens were a team that I did consider for another category, maybe like a moderately concerned category, but they did just come off a big victory over the Buffalo Bills, so it does feel like they're heading in the right direction. So that's why I have them in the totally fine category. And other than that, I feel like every single team is fairly self-explanatory. These are teams that, in my opinion, are already playing some really good football, or they're where we expected them to be, or they're already playing above expectations, such as a team like the Minnesota Vikings. But now let's move on to our moderately concerned category. Again, I didn't want to go into too much detail about the totally fine teams because those are very self-explanatory. This is now where we start to get a bit more into the interesting side of things with our moderately concerned one. And we're going to go at this one team by team. We're going to begin with the Cincinnati Bengals. For the Cincinnati Bengals, I like a lot of things from what I've seen the past couple weeks, but it hasn't resulted in a lot of victories. They're 1-3. They've had some big time losses, and obviously they've had some really bad losses like the New England Patriots game. But they're coming off a victory over the Carolina Panthers in not really amazing fashion. But this is a Bengals team that is notorious for always starting a little bit slow, so it kind of should be expected. With that said, though, you always want them to play better, and they haven't quite hit their stride yet. That's why I'm not fully panicked, because we've seen this before, and they've come out and played better in the second half of the season and made a big time playoff push. So for now, I'm moderately concerned, but if they have another couple losses this upcoming weeks, then they're potentially moving into my full-on panic category. Then we have the Indianapolis Colts. For Indianapolis, you're 2-2, which I think is totally fine. I think you're second in the division. The issue for me is that Anthony Richardson hasn't looked good this season, and now he's having an injury. We'll see if that plagues him for the rest of the season or the upcoming weeks. I'm not too sure on his status. But for this Colts team, I expect them to play a little bit better. I would say their record is fine. 2-2 is totally fine, but the way they've gotten their victories hasn't been as clean as I would like it to be. Anthony Richardson, again, hasn't looked good, which is understandable because he's very young, but I kind of want to see him play a tad bit better. The defense still has a couple issues, but I don't really think that I'm full-on panicking, but I'm also not just chilling and waiting. I want to see this team play better. Then there's the Las Vegas Raiders. I easily could have put them in the full-on panic option, but they do have a victory over the Baltimore Ravens, which was very impressive. And to be honest with you, I kind of expected this team to be a bit of a mess. So for them to be 2-2 and have a win over a team like the Ravens is a bit more impressive than where I thought they would actually be. This is a Raiders team that has a lot of seemingly cultural issues right now, with players not really on the same page as their head coach, which is never a good thing. But at the same time, I kind of expected chaos this year, so I'm not terribly shocked. Then there's the Philadelphia Eagles. For Philadelphia, I just have a lot of issues with your coaching staff. You are an extremely injured team right now, so it's very understandable why you lost to a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are playing some really good football. But at the same time, I do feel as if this coaching staff is really holding back this team, whether it's terrible clock management, terrible game situational management, going on 4th down when you really don't need to against the Saints. And yes, I love what I've seen from Saquon Barkley, but Jalen Hurts hasn't looked like the 2022 Jalen Hurts that we've all fallen in love with. And this Eagles defense still has a lot of issues. Again, I'm not totally panicked because this is a team that is dealing with a plethora of injuries, so I'm not quite yet there. But if this team can't get their ship going in the right direction within the next like 3 or 4 weeks, then yeah, they'll probably move up a category. Moving on to the New York Giants, I kind of expected this team to be in this situation. They're clearly not a good team, but the reason why I am moderately concerned is I just think that this team's future is really bleak as long as Daniel Jones' contract is still plaguing this team. Daniel Jones has looked serviceable so far this year, but he's still Daniel Jones. He still hasn't been good by any means. So for me, because Daniel Jones hasn't looked very good, I have a really hard time taking this Giants team seriously, which this was a team that was trying and hopeful to make a playoff spot this year, or at least make a playoff push, because they did so in 2022. But so far this year, it has been basically just the Malik Neighbors show, which is kind of the only reason why it's keeping me away from moving them up a category. Then there is the Chicago Bears. I am moderately concerned, but I'm not quite yet full on panicking yet. And that's simply because Caleb Williams is young and still developing. He's definitely gotten better week by week. It's just been really slow progression. It hasn't been like 1 week he sucks, 1 week he's great, and then he gets better and better and better. For me, as I explained in my analysis of last week's performances, I said Caleb Williams got significantly better each week, but not like by this much. It was just by a really small amount. So because he's getting better each week and he isn't regressing, I'm not worried about him. But at the same time, I would have liked to have seen Caleb Williams play a little bit better as of right now, which he hasn't quite gotten there yet. There's also issues with the offensive line, issues with the run game. And even though this defense has been dominant, I'm just a little bit concerned about what this Bears team can do in terms of this year. But I do think their future is somewhat bright. Then there is the Atlanta Falcons. I know Atlanta has beaten some really good teams like the Saints and the Eagles, but in a sense, they really got lucky in those victories. The Eagles were 1 dropped pass away from basically winning that game. And had the Saints not had some really costly turnovers, the Falcons are probably losing that game as well, which would put them at 0-4 in this hypothetical situation. But with that said, that isn't the situation that you're in. You're 2-2, even though you've actually given up more points than you actually have scored offensively. So I don't want to sit here and say I'm full on panicked yet, but if this team can't iron out some of the issues they're having, then yeah, I might be a tad bit worried about this team. Then there is the New Orleans Saints. If you were to ask me this 2 weeks ago, I would have said this team is totally fine and over exceeding expectations, but they set the bar so high for themselves in the first 2 weeks that in these past 2 weeks where they've struggled and haven't quite had that same offensive flow, it's kind of made me a bit more pessimistic and a bit more concerned about this Saints team. I will say I had very low expectations for this Saints team, but given how good they looked against the Cowboys and against the Panthers, for them to kind of fall back down to earth against the Eagles and then this past week with the Falcons was a little bit disappointing because it looked like this team potentially took that big step forward. So that's kind of why I have them here. Then there's the San Francisco 49ers injuries, and these aren't just, small little injuries. This Christian McCaffrey thing is very concerning. With that said, Brock Purdy has looked good. The run game has still been fine with Jordan Mason. Ayuk is starting to get better and better. He still hasn't looked like the Brandon Ayuk we know. But this team also has a bunch of defensive issues, and the fact that you're 2-2 when I think you've had a fairly easy schedule up to this point has got to feel a little bit disappointing for this Niners team. The only thing that's kind of keeping me away from that full-on panic option is I still feel as if this is an extremely talented team that has an extremely good quarterback. So as long as they have those pieces and that quarterback, I'm not terribly concerned. But for a team that wants to win a Super Bowl, I think we should be a little bit worried about where they're currently at. And the last team that's going to wrap up our moderately concerned category is going to be the Arizona Cardinals. Arizona is 1-3 and have looked competitive in spots, have looked good in spots, but have also had a couple just really weird games. We all knew this was going to be a horrendous defense, which for the most part, it's been pretty bad. They looked good against the Rams, I will say that. Really, they've only had one great game, which is against the Rams, and I thought they had a good game against the Buffalo Bills in week 1. But outside of that, this past recent week, they got destroyed by the Washington Commanders, and Kyler Murray has kind of fallen back down to earth. I will say Marvin Harrison Jr. has looked good, but it's really hard for this team to succeed when they have all their offensive line issues and a really bad defense. But now we go on to our full-on panic category. These are teams that we should be panicking really, really badly. I don't know. And we are going to begin with the Miami Dolphins. For me, it's really inexcusable what Miami is going through right now, because it's kind of insane that they went the entire offseason knowing they had a bad backup quarterback and knowing that they had a starting quarterback who's dealt with injuries in the past and didn't decide to invest in some other option, even though it probably would have been fairly cheap. Like, you look at Joe Flacco, for example, who I know has been brought up by many Dolphins fans, but he's one of the best backup quarterbacks in the NFL, and he wouldn't have cost the Miami Dolphins anything. Whereas you've had to sit there with Tyler Huntley, who I think is a good backup, but the issue is he's had like a week and a half to understand this really complicated offense. But had you brought this guy in, you know, in the offseason, in training camp and whatnot, maybe there's a chance that he could keep this team afloat. You look at a team like the Green Bay Packers, who have Malik Willis keeping them afloat. Hell, look at the Tennessee Titans with Mason Rudolph. They just won their first game of the season off of the back of their backup quarterback. Same thing with like Joe Flacco. He was really good in his start this most recent week, where he had to cover in for an Anthony Richardson who went out with an injury. But instead, this team went into the season with Skylar Thompson, and then Tua, of course, gets injured, and you're forced to play Skylar, and yeah, he's not a good quarterback. And this team just hasn't looked good at all. They look like one of the worst teams in the NFL, and we know that they have the talent to be a good team, and it's just a matter of, okay, when is Tua going to come back, and is this team going to be in a position where they can still make that playoff run with Tua if he comes back healthy within the next couple weeks? Next is going to be the Cleveland Browns. I feel like this one's pretty self-explanatory. Deshaun Watson has gotten better week by week, but similar to Caleb Williams, it hasn't been big jumps. It's been like slightly improved progress from like a 60 overall to like a 70 overall. He hasn't been good, but at the same time, the pieces around him also haven't been. The offensive line isn't very good. The run game is not really quite yet there. And even though the defense has been good, the offense just hasn't been able to get those same things rolling. So no, I don't want to put all of the blame on Deshaun Watson, because I think that's a tad bit unfair, but I do believe he deserves at least a little bit of the blame for this one as well. And when you're paying Deshaun Watson as much money as you are, you expect him to be a game changer, and thus far through the season, he hasn't quite yet been that. And unfortunately, this really talented Browns team is 1-3, and their future looks pretty bleak right now. Then there's the Tennessee Titans. They did just get their first win over the Miami Dolphins in week 4, but that was off of Mason Rudolph, and that was Mason Rudolph just playing really clean football. And the reason why I'm panicking is because this is a team that wanted Will Levis to work out. This was a team that wanted Will Levis to be their guy, but thus far through the season, it hasn't really panned out because of turnovers, inconsistencies, and a couple just boneheaded plays. And so for this Titans team that wants to succeed with Will Levis and now has to stick to Mason Rudolph because Mason Rudolph clearly looks better, it kind of makes you question what this quarterback room is going to look like in the future. This is a Titans team that, in my opinion, has a pretty solid defense. They're really good at stuffing the run. They're decent when it comes to pass coverage. And I think offensively, yes, the offensive line is bad, but you have some talented players like Tyjae Spears, Tony Pollard, and DeAndre Hopkins. So because you have this talent, but you also have this clear issue at the quarterback room, I don't really know where that leads you to head in this season and years beyond. Then there is the Jacksonville Jaguars, another team in the AFC South. This Jaguars team has arguably been the most disappointing team of the NFL season so far. They're 0-4, got embarrassed by the Buffalo Bills, had a pretty close and competitive game with Houston, but still ultimately lost. And similar to a lot of things with the Titans, this is a Jaguars team that actually has talent, but they're also just not playing very well right now. Trevor Lawrence, who I think is very talented, has not looked like the Trevor Lawrence we saw at Clemson. This receiving core outside of Brian Thomas hasn't quite been all that good. Travis Etienne is out there running for his life because that offensive line is goddamn abysmal. And when you look at the defense, they're so banged up in the secondary, and whoever they have out there just isn't playing good football. And you can't and you can't rely on your pass rush to consistently get there because they haven't been that good this year. So for me, I think this is a pretty talented team that just needs a coaching change, and I'm expecting one to be made probably in the next couple of weeks if they can't get this thing going in the right direction. Then there is the Dallas Cowboys. Dallas has a plethora of issues. Right now, they're an injured team. Deron Bland, Kalen Carson, Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence, probably 4 of your best players in your defense are all potentially going to be missing time. And your depth options aren't there, and we've been known that the entire offseason. This is also a team that doesn't have an offense that can carry them because they don't have a good run game. They have a young offensive line, and outside of CeeDee Lamb, they don't really have any receiving threats that really give any defense any issues. So this team is basically getting hard carried by Dak Prescott, who can only do so much because the offense is so limited. And defensively speaking, they're coming off arguably their best performance or second best performance against the Giants, but the Giants are also not a good football team. They got embarrassed by the Ravens, got embarrassed by the Saints, and I think moving forward with their tough schedule, it's going to be really hard for Dallas to stay competitive in that NFC East. Then there is the Carolina Panthers, our second to last team in this category. I know Carolina has looked better the past 2 weeks, but it almost feels like they're shunning their main issue, which is Bryce Young. They invested so much into Bryce Young, draft capital, time, coaching changes, everything into Bryce Young, and it hasn't worked out yet. And because it hasn't worked out, you've been forced to put in a veteran like Andy Dalton, who's actually making your team somewhat competent. And the issue with that is if this team is to win like 6 or 7 or 5 games this year, that probably moves them out of that #1 overall pick spot where they could potentially draft their future quarterback or potentially draft a playmaker or an offensive lineman who's a stud. Not to say they're going to have a bad pick. It will likely still be a top 5 pick, but it does take you out of having the ultimate advantage as that #1 option. And again, I don't expect this Panthers team to just give up on Bryce Young. Bryce Young's value right now is at an all-time low, so I don't think they can either really trade him much. I mean, I don't think there's a team out there that's going to give up too much to go and get him. And so you're in a situation where you have a bad defense and a mediocre offense, but Andy Dalton is kind of carrying this mediocre offense to be decent. So yeah, they're in a tough spot. I do like their head coach, though. I think Dave Canales is the right guy to get this thing on track. It's just going to take him a few years, but yeah, I think we should be panicking about this team. And the last team to conclude this video is going to be the Los Angeles Rams. This was a Rams team that, in my opinion, was one of my favorites to potentially win their division and one of my favorites to be a deep contender in the NFC playoff race. But thus far, they're 1-3. They have a plethora of injuries, and they have not looked as good as I thought they would. Their one win on the season was against the San Francisco 49ers, but that really was a game they probably should have lost. So if they were to lose that game, they would be 0-4, and yeah, the season's done if you're 0-4. They're 1-3, so they can still get the ship going in the right direction, especially once they get these injured players back. But when Matthew Stafford hasn't looked good, the offensive line has had a couple issues, and maybe the biggest thing is that defense can't stop the run and doesn't have the secondary to seriously compete against these high-powered offense. Gives me a lot of issues and a lot of concerns about this Rams team moving forward. And again, when you're talking about a team that I expected to be in a good position late in the season for a playoff spot, right now they're just not there yet. We'll see if they can fix the ship though. But if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. And again, if I didn't go into detail about your favorite team, you can let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to explain my positioning on that team. But I love you guys. Peace.